Alfred. Hi.
How you doing?
I'm good. So I'm John Hanson. I'm the designated broker for both offices, actually all 4 offices in Mountains to Sound and Puget Sound up in Federal Way and Huron. Which office are you in?
Mountains to Sound.
Okay. Are you in the Enumclaw branch or are you in the main office?
I guess the one that's in I guess it's Kent, but I call it Covington because it's closer to Covington in my opinion. But
Yeah.
but I live out in Enumclaw, so hoping to use the branch out here as well.
Oh, good. Good.
So I'm about as new as they come at the moment.
Newly licensed.
Yes, sir.
Cool.
Just a couple weeks.
Great. How'd you feel about the exam? Did you feel like it was easy or difficult or?
I know some people have a problem with the state exam, but I studied my ass off, passed it on the first try.
Good.
So I didn't think it was too bad. It's kind of annoying where they don't give you your score.
Man, that is annoying, isn't it?
But I didn't think it was too bad.
That's good. Do you remember how many math questions you had on the exam?
Not that many. So I think it was like 140 questions. I'd say maybe 20, maybe. So there wasn't like a ton of math. You know, I went through and the program I used did tons of practice exams. So I'd say almost half the questions were questions that I'd already answered on the practice exam. So I knew exactly what the answer was basically going into it because I had done it so many times.
Cool.
So, but I didn't think it was too difficult.
So do I gather that you're a Lions fan?
Just maybe a little bit. Over here. So yeah, I am a Lions fan.
Well, the Lions sure showed some flashes of talent toward the end of the year.
Yeah, once they got rid of or stopped using their offensive coordinator and Campbell started making the calls, Goff actually started performing, but I'm still not a Jared Goff fan though. The guy doesn't know how to throw more than 5 yards down the field, and it drives me insane.
Where did he come from? Didn't he come from the Pac-12? Didn't he come from USC or UCLA or no?
Is it bad that I can't remember? I have to Google it.
I think it was Cal.
Cal?
I think he played for Cal.
Yeah, I came from so well, you know, there's a decent NFL player that came from Cal, plays for Green Bay now. So sometimes they hit it right, sometimes not. Well, so we are at 2:00 and we've got there are 6 of us here right now. I think there'll be more coming. And so this is the Forms Mastery series that I do, and this is the 3rd Wednesday of the month. So of the 4 classes I do each month, this is number 3. So I always do them in that order, you know. So it doesn't matter when you come in to join, you know, doesn't matter. You're going to get the same information, same material. There's not necessarily a flow to it or anything. So we're going to be going over the Form 22A financing addendum today. And we'll probably spend an hour and a half on it. It's become a very complicated form with situations that are complex, and I want to be able to address those. With you, and then in each addendum that we use, you know, this one's the more complicated one. Next week, I'll go over Form 35 and the 35W, which is a waiver of it. But today I'll be doing the 22A, and then after that, the 22D, which is the optional clauses addendum. So if you don't have those forms up and handy, you'll want to probably pull those up and have them handy, the 22A and the 22D. Looks like my camera's slipping a little bit. There. So any questions before we dive in? Okay. All right. And by the way, when you do all 4 of the Forms Mastery classes, you get 8 clock hours total. You know, you'll be given 8 clock hours. So 2 for each of the 4. And so if you're able to, Rakana and Brianna, if you're able to put your video on, I would love that. If not, if there's a reason you can't, I guess I understand. I just like to see the class as I'm talking to you. So with Form 22A, then again, this is an addendum, and an addendum is distinguished from an amendment because an addendum is a singular document attached to the main purchase and sale contract, which I had gone over the previous 2 weeks, right? Form 21. And so the Form 22A is attached to it as an addendum at the time of reaching mutuality between the parties. If there had been a change after we already had mutuality, that's called an amendment. And so that's just it becomes important a lot of times whether it was an addendum or an amendment, because if it's an addendum, it's already part of the agreement. Everybody signed off on it. It's part of the mutuality. And if it's an addendum, that's where it's at. If it's an amendment, it means it came after there was already that mutuality, and one party's proposing the amendment, and the other party doesn't have to accept it. So a little while ago, I had an agent come to me and say that they had mutuality all done, ready to go, ready to close. But then all of a sudden the seller sees, we represented the buyer, but the seller sees their closing statement and says, what? Pay $12,000 of the buyer's closing costs for the buyer? I ain't doing that. I'm not gonna close. And our agent said, well, you haven't said to the listing agent, we have an agreement that says that you are, and so they proposed, the listing side and the seller, listing side and the seller proposed an amendment to raise the purchase price to account for the closing costs. And so his question to me was, can they do this? They can offer anything they want. We don't have to sign it, and we won't. Do not have your buyers sign that. You already have a pre-agreed meeting of the minds that they were going to pay the buyer's closing costs, which is, by the way, the very first item at the top of page 2 of the financing addendum we're going over today. So guess what happened? See, I don't know this for sure, but I kind of do. The listing agent didn't notice that there was an amount written in on that paragraph 3 at the top of the second page of the financing addendum. Did up their net proceeds without it, and the seller was happy. Now the seller goes to closing, sees a difference, screams foul, and the listing agent, to avoid having to admit that they made a mistake, came to us trying to get us to try to change something. And I said, no way. To our agent, I said, no way. You have the buyer get a lawyer, you have them sue for specific performance and force the seller to do what they contracted to do. And whether the buyer does that or not, we will go after the commission because we've earned the commission. And they will have to pay the commission. When people sign a contract, it's binding. And you can't, there's no arbitrary anything about it. It's just, you know, you have to do what's in the contract, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So if it was a mistake made by that agent, so the agent that came in, my agent that came in and asked me the question, said, what do you think the best solution would be? I'd say if the listing agent eats it, because the listing agent made the mistake. And the listing agent's going to have to eat that cost out of their commission. Otherwise, buyer gets a lawyer, sues for specific performance. We get a lawyer, sue for the commission. And then it's going to cost that seller a whole lot more than it would have cost him otherwise. So that'll be an interesting one to see as it unfolds. But anyway, so they had their agreement, and then that other party, when they realized the mistake, proposed an amendment to us, but we didn't have to take it. They could have proposed the amendment saying that we would buy them season tickets to the Seahawks next year, but no, it's not going to happen. We're not going to sign anything like that, right? They've got to do what they contracted to do, and we don't have to sign any changes after that. Okay, so with that in mind, this addendum, and by the way, singular, the word is addendum, and then plural, it's addenda. So when you see the word addenda, that's just the plural of addendum, like cactus and cacti and that kind of, right? So looking at this financing addendum 22A, at the top of it, as with every other addendum that we use, you're going to be filling in some information about the main purchase and sale contract. What was the date at the top of that, which is kind of a reference number that's used to tie it in, the buyer's names, seller's names, and then the address, common address of the property. And then this becomes tied in with the Form 21, when the Form 21 makes reference to an addendum 22A. Okay, so in the top left-hand corner of each of the forms, you'll see the form number in small writing up there, the 22A. So this 22A is the financing addendum. It's 3 pages. And so the very first item on it is the loan application. So number 1. So this paragraph has an A and a B, and it takes in lines 6 through 24. This is establishing the parameters of the loan that the buyer is going to get to determine if, in case that buyer gets a denied financing by the lender, it's going to determine whether or not they get their earnest money back. Okay, so a contingency like this should get the buyer's earnest money back, right? But there's some parameters that are being established here. We got to make sure those are clear. And then we got to make sure we can prove that our buyer did those things. Because if the seller at the end, if the buyer didn't get loan approval, the seller could make a claim for the earnest money and say the buyer didn't make a good faith effort. So representing our buyer, we want to make sure our buyer is doing everything they said they were going to do in this paragraph. So in 1A, that says loan application, it says that this agreement is contingent on the buyer obtaining the following type of loan or loans. And then you would check the box or boxes that would apply to the loan that that buyer is getting. So it could be a conventional, a VA, an FHA, a bridge loan, a USDA loan. It can be, whatever it is. And then there's a box for other. So what other kind of loan could there be? Well, there could be a non-conforming loan. sometimes called a hard money lender, so they're not following Fannie Mae guidelines. So it doesn't conform to Fannie Mae guidelines, so it's a non-conforming loan. And if that's the case, then you would check that box other and just put in hard money loan, non-conforming loan, something to that effect. Dan, when we were talking earlier, you used a different word for it. What did you call it?
Like private money lender, hard money lender.
Yeah, private money lender. I think you said private lender, something like that. So that would be good to to put in too. Any of those would be good to put in there. Now, let's say that your buyer is getting a conventional loan. So you check the box for conventional first, right? And then the buyer is getting down payment assistance from a down payment assistance program. In that case, you would check conventional first, and you would check the box other, and you would write in there DPA, or down payment assistance, to disclose that they're also getting down payment assistance, so that if they get denied that down payment assistance, they would get their earnest money back. Because we've had situations happen that I've been involved in where we represented the seller and the buyer never disclosed that they were getting a down payment assistance on it. And when they got denied that because the down payment assistance money wasn't available in that moment of time, the buyer wanted their earnest money back, and we said, no way. You never said you were getting down payment assistance. It was never disclosed. It was never part of the contingency. So our seller gets the earnest money, and we won in the two cases. I can remember when that happened. We won both of them, and our seller got the earnest money. And that's what a good listing agent and firm is going to do, is fight for their client's right to get the earnest money if the buyer defaults. Didn't disclose, didn't put it out there. So we want to always disclose and put it out there. The reason sometimes people don't do that is because they're trying to get their offer accepted. And they're thinking, if I put that in there, maybe they won't take my offer, or, whatever. I don't want to make. If it's going to be a part of the transaction, it's got to be out there and disclosed. And so that's what I would suggest doing. If there's down payment assistance, is checking the other box on line 8, in addition to the conventional first or the FHA box for the type of financing they're getting. Any questions about that? Okay, then on the next line 9 is where you're going to put in the amount of down payment the buyer is going to pay down. And we want to establish that because we want to know that if there is a dispute on the earnest money, that the buyer is able to live up to what they said they were going to do. They're paying this much down payment, right? X amount down payment. What if that down payment money is coming from a loan from Uncle Pete? Uncle Pete said he was going to give them the money for their down payment. And then we get down toward closing, and Uncle Pete changes his mind, gets upset about something in the family, and says, I'm not going to give you that money anymore. Okay, so that means the buyers are going to lose their earnest money if that happens. So usually, if there's going to be a gift of funds like that, we would have to we would have to disclose it, because it's always deemed to be cash. It's always assumed that it's going to be cash, unless it's been written and approved that it's some other form, like a loan or a gift or something. Okay, so you're not going to know the answers to these things unless you've been in communication with the buyer's lender. So early on, you're going to, as you talk to your buyer, you're going to say, do you mind if I have a conversation with the lender, so that I know once we find the right house for you, I know how to write the contract, because I'll have to include the type of loan, the down payment, things like that. Okay. So,
What do you do if the buyer hasn't been pre-approved yet? And you don't know what down payment they're gonna make at this point until they get fully pre-approved?
well, this is a very difficult question, because I personally, I wouldn't work with the buyer I wouldn't write up a deal for a buyer unless they've been pre-approved. So I would, I know sometimes there's weird circumstances, and if that happened, they'd be taking a risk, because you'd have to take some guesses, some stabs in the dark, and hope that works. But that's dangerous. And so, as professionals, we always want to make sure they're pre-approved, and we know from the lender how much they're going to have to put down for the type of loan they're getting, and what type of loan they're getting. Right. And then on line 11, right below that, is a blank where if you don't fill it in, it defaults to 5 days. It says in parentheses, it says 5 days if not filled in. So that means that the buyer is going to make their loan application within 5 days of mutual acceptance, mutual agreement on the contract. So now my question, to come back to your question, Dan, about, so if I'm the listing agent and I find out, and I get your offer from you, and your offer just does the default, nothing's filled in, so it defaults to 5 days that your buyer has to make their application. But I had received, with your offer, I had received the pre-approval letter from the lender. So my thinking as a listing agent is, he's got a pre-approval, not pre-qualification, pre-approval, and yet needs 5 days to make the application. So this is how long it takes to make an application. Once you've already been pre-approved, the only thing the lender has to do is put the address of the property on that approval, and then the buyer's got to sign it. That's it. So that takes, around 30 seconds to do, but certainly not 5 days. So if I'm the listing agent and I see that offer come in from Dan and it's got a pre-approval on there, I'm probably going to counter offer it and put in a 1 on that. And you got to do it in 1 day. So that 30-second task that your buyer has to do has to get done in the next 24 hours, right? More or less. Should be doable, shouldn't it? Right? So the reason I'm suggesting that to you, if you're the listing agent, is because you want to make sure that that we're not wasting time in this process, because the loan process is the lengthiest thing to getting this loan or getting this transaction all closed and done.
Unless your buyer wants to shop lenders, right?
Well, if the buyer wants to shop lenders, which they certainly have the right to do, that's fine. But they're going to want to do it. If I'm the listing agent, they're going to want to do it really quick. They're going to want to do it within 24 hours. They're not going to want to spend 5 days doing it. And if they are going to spend 5 days doing it, you're the buyer's agent, Heidi, you would probably want to call me first and say, hey, this offer I sent over, it says 5 days to make application for the loan. And the reason for the 5 days is because the buyer's already been pre-approved through one lender, but they want to shop a couple of other lenders and see if they can get, better interest rate, better points on their loan or whatever it is, and see where they're most comfortable. So one of the things that commonly happens in our business is that the buyer has a pre-approval letter included with their loan, and then the listing agent, our listing agent, finds out 10 days later that they did never make the application with that lender. They used a whole nother lender that the listing agent and the seller didn't even know about. And I get calls on that with angry listing agents. I say, and what's the problem with that? There's nothing wrong with that. Well, my seller accepted the offer based on this lender. Well, there's nothing that said they had to go through that lender. It just said they had to make an application within 5 days, or within 1 day if I was the listing agent, right? Within 1 day, they had to make their application. But up until the deadline that's on this line, they can talk to as many lenders as they want. They can make application with as many lenders as they want. But once the date on this line 11 has come, whether it's 5 days or 1 day or whatever it is, once that's passed, that's it. Now the buyer cannot make any other applications with the lenders without the approval of the seller, the written approval of the seller. So that's Form 22AC. Form 22AC is the form, just a really short little form that would be used to get the seller's written permission for the buyer to change lenders or to change the type of loan they're getting. Because if the buyer at any time changes the type of loan they're getting, even if it's in the first day, that's a breach. And now the buyer waives their financing contingency automatically because they changed the type of loan without getting the seller's permission first. So that Form 22AC serves for both of those situations, both when the buyer, either one of them, if the buyer is going to be changing the type of loan or if the buyer is going to be changing lenders. And we've got to get the seller's approval on that. That's specified in paragraph 1B, and that's lines 16 to 23, for where it's showing the 3 things that would create a waiver of this buyer's financing contingency. And those 3 things are, first on line 16, fails to make application within those number of days they set on line 11, 5 or 1 or whatever it be, or 2 on line 17, changes the type of loan at any time without seller's written consent. That would waive their financing, so they always want to make sure they do that. And then the third one is changing the lender without the seller's prior written consent after the agreed upon time written in line 11 there. Okay, so here's what you think, well, this doesn't really involve me, this is between them and the lender. No, it does involve you, because your buyer probably doesn't know about this, right? And it's very possible, if not probable, that the lender doesn't know about it. So the lender, maybe you were there with your borrower when they were making their application, maybe, and then maybe 3 days later, that lender calls the buyer up and says, hey, you know what? I was just looking at your, for a conventional loan, I was looking at your loan to value ratios and things, and I think that if we went with an FHA, I could just get you in on a slam dunk. Let's just switch you over to FHA. Well, the buyer's going to say, well, all right, why not? Well, they just breached that contract. The remedy for that breach is that the buyer waives the financing contingency. So to avoid that problem happening, you're going to want to talk to the buyer's lender before, at the very beginning, and just explain to the buyer's lender, okay, so what type of loan are they getting? Well, they're getting a conventional loan, great. And so how much down payment are they going to have to make? Okay, great. So I'll know how to fill in the form. I just want you to know, lender, that if those things change, we've got to get the seller's permission, written permission to change those. So we can't just go flip-flopping back and forth on type of loan without getting the seller's written approval to do so before doing so. So please don't get our buyers into trouble. with doing that, is how I would say it to the lender. Okay, so it's our client, it's our buyer, it's also the lender's client, the lender's buyer. And the lender would not want to get them in trouble intentionally, but they're just not familiar with our forms. So it's an easy mistake for that lender to make. Okay, so those are the things that could waive the buyer's financing contingency. Doesn't terminate the deal, doesn't give the seller termination rights. It just waives the contingency of getting financing approval for the buyer, which is basically the protection of their earnest money, right? Okay, so that form again is 22 AC. If you need to get the seller's permission for change of financing or change of the lender. All right, any questions about section one application? Section 2, financing contingency. So this section, the rest of the first page here, is where you're going to need to select either A or B for number 2. A says seller's notice to perform, and B says automatic waiver of financing contingency. So for the buyer, it's going to be best to have A checked. But for the seller, it's going to be best to have B checked. So if I'm the listing agent, protecting my seller as best I can, and you're writing an offer for your buyer, which one are you going to check? Because my seller, under my guidance, is probably not going to accept an offer with A checked, because we want B checked. So you might want to, not just think about what's going to be in the best interest of your buyer, but also talk to your buyer about, how do you think the seller is going to be most likely to accept or not accept your offer, right? So, again, it's your buyer's choice of which box they want to check. If they check A, seller's notice to perform, it means that the buyer has 21 days to get their loan. Uh, 21 days isn't a ton of time, right? To get that all wrapped up. So the lender's going to have to be moving like that. And so for this box A, it's saying that after the 21 days is up, the buyer's deadline, we'll call it, to get their financing approved. Now I'm the listing agent. You represent the buyer. As the listing agent, I'm going to send over to you Form 22AR. Form 22AR is a notification to you that you have 3 days. Oh, she's not here. Sorry, there was a chat here. There's no sound. Brianna, there's no Elizabeth in the Zoom.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're sitting here. We were doing our market center orientation, and
okay.
she was trying to get added in.
Okay. Yes, she would need, all she's got to do is sign in, and then she'll show up on my queue and I'll let her in. But she's not there now. Okay, so, so I'll watch, or you can just tell me when she comes in. So, where was I? Oh, okay, so if I'm the listing agent now, and your 21 days is up, then I'm sending you that 22 AR, letting you know you have 3 days to either prove that you have gotten loan approval or waive your financing contingency, one or the other. Or else my seller can terminate the transaction. Terminate the transaction. So if your buyer really wants that property, this is a good way for them to lose it, to lose out on getting it. And your buyer's going to have to move quickly with the lender, get that approval. If they don't get it, I give the notice to you, the 22 AR. And then based on the 22 AR, you now have 3 days to either prove the approval has been obtained or else waive the financing contingency.
You get the approval, like let's say you're the list, or let's say you're the buyer's agent and you get the 22 AR. I mean, other than like verbally saying, yeah, we're approved. Is there like a document?
Yeah, so something from the lender saying they've been approved.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that way, if that lender lied, which surprise of surprises, sometimes they do, right? Sometimes they lie. So if a lender lies, what do? If we lie, guess what happens to us? We get reported to the Department of Licensing, right? And the Department of Licensing takes a disciplinary action against us. If a lender does that, then we report them to the DFI, the Department of Financial Institutions in the state of Washington. DFI, Department of Financial Institutions, and these disciplines are frequent with lenders. If you ever thought real estate agents were renegades, man, you haven't seen the lender. Just go to the dfi.wa.gov page sometime and look at, and they print them all out. You can look at all the violations and people whose licenses are suspended. And it's probably a good idea for you to do that anyway, to make sure the lender your buyer's using isn't on that list. Wouldn't that be a good idea?
What's that website?
dfi.wa.gov. The first time I pulled that up was like 2009, I think. First time I pulled that up. And the violations and disciplines was like 4 pages long. But you know why? Because that was right when they were slamming the door down for the first time and saying, we're going to start disciplining lenders, right? And so that was like the beginning of it. So I'm curious now. I don't know how many there are now, but boy, there was a ton of them back in the day. So that's if the first box 2A is checked. If the second box, which is 2B, as in boy, is checked, that means that instead of the seller listing agent having to give you the 22 AR notice, after 21 days, financing is just automatically waived. Period. Boom. So that could be an issue for your buyer, right? So in that case, let's say that you're with your buyer, you're monitoring how your buyer's loan's going, you're at day 19, and they haven't got approval and it's not expected for a couple of days. If that, and it's like a 50-50 shot they're even going to get approved and the buyer's nervous about the earnest money. So the buyer says, you know what, I think I just want out. I want to terminate and be out. So if that's the case, then before that 21st day, you're going to have to send the 22, the 90I. Form 90I is the form you would send in as the buyer's agent for when your buyer is denied financing. Form 90I. You want to jot that down. If you haven't, so that's you all, whenever there's a contingency and your buyer wants to get their earnest money and be out, the very first step you always must take is give a notification of termination. Always give a notification of termination. Don't even talk about the earnest money yet, because you can't even go after the earnest money unless you've given that written notice of termination. So you use Form 90I, and then Form 90I notifies them of the loan denial, and that Form 90I, it says on it that it's required that you also include a letter from the lender that specifies 3 things. It specifies that they made their loan application in time. It specifies that they had sufficient funds to close, money on hand. And then it specifies that the reason for the loan denial. And without that, you can't get the earnest money back for your buyer. So you've got to always make sure you get that lender's letter, and then you give them the Form 90I along with that letter. Then you can start trying to get the earnest money back. Then you send over the form either 51 or 50, either one, either 50 or 51 directs the earnest money back to your buyer. What's the difference? Well, the difference, which is, not normally a big deal, because like as the designated broker, I don't even care which one you use. You can use 50 or 51, it doesn't matter to me. But there was a title company that got sued last year because they directed the parties to use Form 51. And what Form 51 does is it terminates the buyer's rights and the seller's rights in the contract. Well, that's usually what buyers and sellers want when they're terminating a deal. What they usually want is they want to have something signed that says that the one party can't sue the other. But in this case, with this title company, they wanted the right to sue the other side, even beyond after the deal was already dead. Form 51 closes the door on that. Form 50 would have left the door open for one party to sue the other. And so the party that couldn't sue the other instead sued the title company and won. Well, because the title company just gave them the money. They settled. and so because of that, there's been all this talk around our MLS and stuff about, oh, you always use Form 50. No, don't always use Form 50. The party needs to choose which one they want to use. Form 50 directs the earnest money back to the buyer, but leaves the buyer and seller's door open to sue each other if they want. Okay, so lawyers would prefer that because lawyers, of course, want to be able to continue litigation and suing and stuff like that. We typically don't want to see the parties suing each other anymore. We want to kind of close the door on litigation, right? So 51 is, in my opinion, the better form to use for terminating, and directing the earnest money back to the other party. But the client should make that decision. As far as, there's pros and cons that could go with it either way. So we don't want to just insist and pull one out. We want to say, do you want to use Form 50 or 51? Form 50 leaves the door open for you and the seller to sue each other if you want. Form 51 closes that door. Okay, so going back to Going back to paragraph 2A and B, at the end of each of those two paragraphs, you'll notice that there is a, so for 2A, it would be the small letter 3, lines 35 and 36, where there's a two check boxes for either will or will not, right? And on 2B, it would be lines 42 and 43. There's two check boxes for either will or will not. What does that mean? What it means is that if, for whatever reason, the buyer should have to waive their financing contingency, their waiver of their financing contingency either will or will not also waive their appraisal, the need for getting an appraisal done and having the appraisal meet the purchase price. So for the buyer, they would want to check the box that says will not, because the buyer should want to hang on to that right. Even if they have to waive financing, they should want to hang on to that right to be able to terminate based on a low appraisal, right? Because they're not going to get financing if there's a low appraisal. But a listing agent and the seller, of course, are going to want to see the will, because if the buyer is going to waive their financing, they of course want the buyer to also be waiving the appraisal portion part of that. Make sense? So again, if you're representing the buyer and you're trying to get your offer accepted, you know, maybe your buyer would want to check will, just so that that looks good to the, you know, to the listing agent and the seller, that hey, we're gonna, if we have to waive our financing, we'll also waive that appraisal. So just to take a break from this intense document for a second, I just wanted to tell you that I had a nephew of mine pop in and spend the weekend with me, and I hadn't seen him for 10 years. And that was really a surprise. He's going to law school at Gonzaga University in Spokane, and he just flew over here because he had a couple of doctor appointments, you know, he had to be to over the weekend. So he stayed with me, and hadn't, like I said, I hadn't seen him in 10 years. And the first thing he did was he looked at me and he said, "Oh my gosh, you look exactly like Grandpa," which was my dad, of course. And I said, "Well, I wouldn't say exactly." He says, "No, exactly. You look just like him." I said, "Okay, well, so our bodies probably are the same, right?" He says, "Yeah, exactly like a Dr. Seuss character, like the Who, one of the Who's in Whoville." And I said, "Yeah, like that." But he didn't have any hair on his head at all. I've got at least some strands hanging on here, you know. My dad, so genetics. So here's a conversation I had with someone yesterday. Genetics pretty much map out what you're going to look like when you get older, right? You can look at your dad or your mom and you say, "It's probably what I'm going to look like when I get older," right? How can you change that? This is a question I asked the agent. How can you change that?
Plastic surgery.
Plastic surgery, working out more, eating better, right? Those things can change that. But my point, talking to this other agent yesterday, was you've got to be proactive and do something, because if you just let things happen, genetics are gonna make it be the same, right? It's kind of that way in our business. We can either just sit and wait for stuff to happen, or we can be proactive and get out there and make it happen the way, you know, we would rather see it happen, right? Instead of just falling into place by sheer coincidence or chance. So anyway, so I just wanted to share that thought with you. I thought it was interesting, and I thought it was funny that my nephew was just freaking out that I looked so much like my dad, because I never thought I looked like him. Page 2 of this financing addendum has that dangerous line right at the top, very first line of page 2, line 44, where if the offer has written in there an amount, it means the seller is agreeing to pay that amount of the buyer's closing costs for the buyer. Does anyone know right offhand how much the seller's closing costs are? What percentage of the purchase price they usually are?
Roughly 10%.
Roughly, okay. Yeah, 9.5, I guess, but really close, between 9 and 10. So the seller's got to bite into a pretty bitter pill right there, right? Just for their own closing costs. Now, you're going to ask the seller who's having to bite that bitter pill to also pay the buyer's closing costs for the buyer? In a market like this, that's pretty unusual, isn't it? This provision was written in back in 2008, I think, when it first came out, when this thing was first done, because that was when the market was just dead with no buyers, tons of sellers couldn't get rid of the property, and sellers were willing to do that. Now they're not so willing to do that, But in that situation I gave you at the very beginning of this class, that the agent came into my office this morning to talk to me about, was the situation where that was written in for an amount that the seller was agreeing to pay of the buyer's closing costs. And the seller, for the first time on her closing statement, saw it and had a fit. And the listing agent apparently didn't want to admit they made a mistake and didn't point that out to them on their net proceeds sheet. So now that agent was trying to bully a little bit and just get us to agree to raise the price to account for those closing costs. No, we're not going to change the contract 3 weeks down the line. No. You agreed to this 3 weeks ago, you got to do it. You got to fulfill what you agreed to do contractually. So be careful of that line if you're the listing agent. And if you're the buyer's agent, of course, this is just a place where you would request that as part of the offer, that the seller pay a portion of the buyer's closing costs for the buyer. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Paragraph 4 is the paragraph that talks about those 3 things that you're going to have itemized out by the lender to go along with your Form 90I termination. If you're trying to get the buyer's earnest money back on the contingency, you're going to want to have that, make sure that lender's letter includes the date the buyer made their loan application, that the buyer possessed sufficient funds to close and for their down payment, and the reasons the buyer was unable to obtain financing on line 57. So you always want to have those 3 things explained by the lender in their letter attached to the Form 90I, which is the termination notice form.
Quick question. I think I might have got lost here a little bit.
Yeah.
Somewhere along lines. We're still doing the 22A, right?
Correct.
Okay.
We're on page 2. We're on page 2.
Because it doesn't have some of the things that you were talking about. That's why I think I was getting a little lost. I pulled up the addenda packet that was emailed out, but on page 2, number 4 is at the top. For loan cost provisions.
That says number 4.
Yeah.
Okay, you got the old version. So they unfortunately sent you the old version. So in March of last year of 21, they revised it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this one's dated 2019. It's what the office sent me. So
Okay. Yeah, they sent you an old one. So I'll let Goldie know to get the current form.
okay, that's why I knew we were on it, but I was starting to get confused. I don't see this on my form here.
Yeah. Yeah, they do forms revisions every once in a while, and it causes a little bit of a disturbance, but I kind of like it because then it just gives us more value, you know, to know our forms, to be on top of everything. And it just gives us such an advantage over the agents who don't get this kind of class we're doing right now. They don't have that opportunity or get updated by a designated broker who's really kind of obsessed with stuff like that, which I am. So, yeah, so anyway, so that's why. Okay, so paragraph 5 now, which I think in yours, in the old form was 7, which is appraisal less than purchase price.
Yeah.
Okay, so in that paragraph, which is now lines 61 through 80. Well, actually, it goes 61 through the rest of the page, because there's a buyer's reply section here too. So it's most of this page 2 is this, what happens when the appraisal comes in less than the sales price. Now, in the last 8 years or so, that's been super common to have happen, have the appraisal come in low. And as prices go up and up and up, the chances of having the appraisal come in low go up and up and up, because appraisers, even though they will not ever admit to this, appraisers are always basing value on something that happened in the past. So a sale that happened 4 months ago, they're going to use that as a comparable, right? Okay, that was 4 months ago. In today's market, do values change in 4 months? Yeah, today's market, they change. They changed a lot in 4 months. And so appraisers are not necessarily accounting for that because they're dealing with the past. So what I was going to say is that it's really common for that appraisal to come in low these days, and we want to be prepared for when that happens, both on the listing side and on the buyer's side, because there's 2 different strategies, 2 different things that can happen, and you want to just make sure you know how to best represent your client if and when that happens. So if the appraisal comes in less than sales price, I all of a sudden got feedback. I mean, echo, that's what it's called, echo. Okay, went away. Okay, so if the appraisal comes in low, then you, the buyer's agent, representing the buyer, gets notified of that low appraisal, and now you have 3 days to deliver the notice of the low appraisal from the lender to the listing agent, along with Form 22AN. Form 22AN is the notice of low appraisal. Okay, and it says it right on there. So then, after that's delivered to the listing agent, the seller, I should say, has 10 days to deliver a response back. I just dealt with this over the weekend with an agent who was representing the buyer, had a low appraisal, sent the notice 22AN over to the listing agent, and said, it's already been 3 days and I haven't heard back. How many days do they get? And I said, 10. Where does it say that? 22A, right there. Right? 10 days to get that notice back to the buyer as to what the seller is going to do. Now, that's needed because one of the remedies on this is that the lender will change the requirement for the appraisal. Sometimes the lender will override the appraiser. It's rare, but sometimes they will. And if the lender overrides the appraiser, then you're going to want to make sure that that's done in time within those 10 days. And that's a lot to get done in those 10 days. So it's going to be moving, pretty quick. That listing agent and seller are going to have to move pretty quick to see if they can get the lender to make adjustments. Maybe something was wrong with the appraiser's appraisal, and the lender would back you up in it. Maybe the appraiser, him or herself, will go ahead and change the appraisal if something is brought to their attention that maybe was not good on the appraisal. It's really rare they will ever do that, because one part of that is their pride, so they got to swallow their pride. But they've got 10 days to do it, and then on Form 22AN, if you have that Form 22AN, again, that's in the top left-hand corner, small writing where the form numbers are. That's the notice that you've given to the seller as the buyer's agent. Your buyer signed and dated it. Buyer signed and dated it. Now the seller's got it. The seller has 10 days to respond with one of these 4 choices right here. So the first choice is a notice of reappraisal or reconsideration of value. So if they can get that before the 10th day, that's great. That's the box they would check. But if they can't get it in 10 days, then they're going to have to agree to one of the other 3 choices here. The second one is to consent to a reduction in the purchase price down to what it appraised for. Okay, so during a buyer's market, that's what's usually done right now. And for the last few years, we've been in a seller's market, so it's rarely done, but sometimes is, because it's just recognized by the parties that the seller was being unreasonable with the price, or let's say, for example, that we had multiple offers. Let's say we had 6 offers, and they all used escalation addendums, and each of those, each escalation addendum escalates the other, and so all of a sudden this $610,000 property is now has a purchase price of $670,000, which is happening commonly in this market. Now the problem could be that appraisal is going to come in low, right? I would say likely the appraisal is going to come in low. So the issue there is that that if you're a listing agent and you've got that situation with the multiple offers coming in, and there's a really good chance that that's going to be a low appraisal, then what you might want to do before getting signed off on this deal is counter offer it with a Form 22AD. So if you have Form 22AD there, you'll see that Form 22AD is what the buyer is going to pre-agree now that they're going to bring in an extra money for additional down payment if the appraisal comes in low. It's amazing during this market how buyers are just getting hosed, as they say in Canada, like crazy, because the buyers are not only having to pay these exorbitant prices, but if the appraisal comes in low, now the whole expectation is that they come up with extra money for that even. Well, if the buyer wants that property, sometimes that's what they got to do, And so it's unfortunate. I don't like it, but that's just how the market is right now.
So if that were to happen, with the low appraisal, would it depend on what box we checked if we would get the earnest money back?
Which box you checked where?
Oh, I'm just saying, in the financing addendum.
Okay, yeah, that would affect that, yes. So you want to, so whether you checked will or will not, but that, again, that only applies, those two things under number 2, A or B, only applies if the buyer has had to waive their financing. So if the buyer doesn't ever waive their financing, but the appraisal comes in low, then it's not applicable. So if they're just, if we're just moving forward to get financing and then we finally find out, 3 days before we're expecting to get the approval or disapproval, whatever, that the appraisal came in low, okay, those things don't come into play, those two boxes. So it's just a low appraisal. Now we've got to deal with it by sending out this form 22AN, giving notice of that low appraisal, and then the seller's got to, within 10 days, come back with their response here of one of these 4 things. The first one being that reappraisal or reconsideration of value. The second choice the seller has is to consent to reduce the purchase price down to what it appraised for. And the third one is to propose a reduction of purchase price that maybe meets in the middle somewhere, right? Buyer doesn't have to accept that. But sometimes sellers will propose that and think, well, let's just split the difference, Well, that's great if the buyer's got the money or can come up with the money. Sometimes they have a relative that will give them the money. I'm shocked at how much money people are coming up with during this market, the seller's market. It's just amazing to me. It's like monopoly money. I'm just like, are we playing with monopoly money now, or is this real money? And it really is real money. It just seems like monopoly money. And then the last choice the seller has in their response here is notice of rejection of the low appraisal, meaning I could care less, buyer. It's your loan, it's your appraisal, you deal with it. So if either of those last 2 I just read are checked, the buyer can terminate. If the seller checks one of those 2, the buyer can just say, okay, I'm out. And then the very first thing in the buyer's reply section, lines 27, 28, is box would be checked saying notice of termination. I'm out. So sellers, got to think about it before, because yeah, maybe they can go get another buyer, but now they got to wait for another 21 days or 30 days or whatever. And then maybe the same thing is going to happen, right? There's a lot to consider in this market with the things that are going on. But anyway, the seller signs their response, dates it, goes back to you, the buyer's agent. Now you go to your buyer and you say, okay, what do we want to do? We have the right to terminate, or we can check the box, the second box here, which is just waiving the financing. Or we could check the third box, which is for accepting the proposal the seller made about reducing the price. That was the seller's third one there, right? So we could accept that proposal the seller's made, or we could check the fourth box and basically terminate if it was a government loan. So the buyer, if it's an FHA or VA loan, the buyer can terminate anyway, even if the seller is willing to reduce the price. If the appraisal came in low, the buyer can just out and out terminate. So really, the first, second, third choices at the end there for the buyer are what they really are dealing with. So when we first made the offer, we were dealing with maybe another buyer competing to try to buy this listing. Now we are dealing with, we had to go get financing and we've gotten a low appraisal, so now we got to negotiate that out. Maybe we got to negotiate out what's going on in the inspection and the inspection report. So there's a lot of components built into this and a lot of things that require our knowledge and our expertise to be able to help guide our client through these situations. So when I hear buyers and sellers saying we make too much money, and I think of all the money that we save them with our knowledge of what we're doing, I think we're cheap, inexpensive cheap, because of all that we save for them when we know what we're doing. But I would say a not so good agent, like the one that was on the listing side this morning that didn't show their buyer page 2 of the financing addendum, the top of it that showed how much they were gonna have to pay the buyer's closing costs. Okay, that agent didn't earn their money. And so, yeah, they should reduce from their commission the amount that the seller now has to pay in the buyer's closing costs, in my opinion. Okay, so that's Form 22AN. And again, the 22AD that I was talking about, is that form that you can either, for your buyer in submitting an offer, you can either include in your offer. So let's say you're in a super competitive situation and the price is going to get escalated above their ask price, but you also know the ask price was probably low. And you're just thinking to yourself, if they get bumped up, they're still probably getting a really good deal. And you've talked to your buyer about that, and your buyer thinks the same thing. And then and now your buyer knows they're competing with 5 or 6 other offers, and they want to make theirs look good. They might want to include this Form 22AD, the additional down payment form, to show that if the appraisal comes in low, they're willing to pay this amount of money extra for their down payment that the seller gets.
So you can send that addendum, the increased down payment for low appraisal, before the appraisal even comes back.
Oh,
Cool.
yeah,
Learn
that's
something new.
so typically when I see this used, this Form 22AD, it's used when the buyer's making the offer to try to make their offer stronger so the seller will want to take their offer. And it may or may not get used, right? We don't know what the appraisal, how the appraisal is going to come out. But the buyer is telling the seller, look, if my appraisal comes in low, I'm even going to pay extra money, to make up, so that in cash, so that you don't lose out on anything, right? So that's a pretty strong offer. Sometimes the listing agent seller are going to counter offer an offer and say, great, we'll take your offer as long as we can have you pay this extra money if the appraisal comes in low. So not your knowledge that this exists, this Form 22AD exists, is super important, as you can see, because you can make your buyer's offer look stronger, or if you're a listing agent, you can counter offer an offer to make it a stronger offer. Because this is one of those unforeseens that comes down the line, and really we're getting paid for having foresight into things that could happen and preparing our client for those things in advance. And then, by the way, we also have a Form 22AA. So we're going over the Form 22A, but I'm just going to jump it ahead a little bit. This Form 22AA, AA, is a form that is used when the buyer is paying cash and not getting financing, but wants to have an appraisal done of the property. If that's the case, this is a form that would be used, and the Form 22AD also works with this form. So you would never use Form 22A and Form 22AA at the same time. You would never do that. You would use one or the other. Either Form 22A, the financing addendum, or the Form 22AA, which is basically the cash addendum, but with the appraisal contingency.
John, how would a seller go about ordering an appraisal if they're paying cash?
They would just contact an appraiser
Okay.
directly. But I will say this, that most of the time that that's being used, that I'm saying, is in a situation where their offer is not contingent upon getting a loan approval. It's not contingent on that, but they're still borrowing money. So they're using a non-conforming lender, hard money lender, or whatever.
Okay.
And they've disclosed in writing, of course, that they're getting a hard money lender, but that it's not contingent on that. And then they use a Form 22AA, AA, in case that appraisal comes in low.
Okay. So they'd want to include it in that scenario 22 EF for evidence of funds and a 22 AA.
Correct.
Okay.
That's a lot of stuff. That financing contingency is a lot of stuff, a lot of forms. And so those are some good things to go over, on your own. Instead of watching Family Feud, you can I'm just joking because I always watch Family Feud. I love Family Feud. You can go over those forms. Okay, so so unless you have other questions about that, let me just address one more thing. On the top, on Form 22A, on the top of page 3, number 6, item number 6, in the new revised, well, it was revised almost a year ago, but the one that you don't have.
Oh, I've got it. Mike sent me over a copy, so I'm up to date now.
Oh, cool. Great. So this one is seller shall permit inspections required by the lender, including but not limited to structural, pest, heating, plumbing, roof, electrical, septic, and well inspection. The seller is not obligated to pay for such inspections unless otherwise agreed. Okay, so that's just giving permission for the lender to go do inspections if they need to do inspections for the loan purposes, right? So we have two distinct issues that agents on a pretty regular basis get confused about because their clients are confused. One of those is that we have an inspections contingency, which is Form 35, which is totally separate and apart from this financing. And then we have this financing where the lender is concerned about the condition of the property for their loan purposes. It's their collateral. Of course, they don't want their collateral to all fall apart and have no value. So they want to make sure that their collateral is going to have value. So they may want to inspect it on their own. And they usually don't send out an inspector, to go out and check the property out. What they usually do is they give the appraiser instructions to check on a couple of things that they maybe are concerned about with this property because maybe it's an older property and they want to make sure that the roof is a newer roof, or they want to make sure that that the siding is still, intact. And so they ask the appraiser while they're doing the appraisal, they say, would you check on the siding and see if it's okay, that kind of thing, right? Now, this morning I had a question from an agent that was kind of an interesting one, because she said, well, the appraiser is requiring this, this, and this. And I said, well, appraisers can't require that. It's none of their business. They're not a part of the contract and they're not lending the money. And she said, well, but the appraiser, it says that the appraiser is an employee of this bank that's doing the loan. I said, well, that's different. That's called an in-house appraiser. So basically that's an employee of the bank doing the appraisal. So they're going to, have some very strict instructions from their employer about the condition of the property. So they were asking for a lot of specific stuff that seemed really unreasonable. And she didn't understand why they were doing that. And when she said that they were an employee of the bank, that's why. This is not an independent appraiser. This is someone following their employer's instructions, which is really rare. She asked, is that really rare? And I said, that's really rare. Yes. They're usually independent appraisers. So, paragraph 7, 8, 9 are issues that aren't that big of a deal. So we'll just leave Form 22A and all of its adjoining addenda, and then go to Form 22D, which is the optional clauses addendum. Mike, who is your sponsor? Who is the one who brought you into the office?
My wife, Andrea.
Oh, awesome.
Yep.
So maybe, or maybe not, you'll get some money from that down the road, back from that.
Yeah, right.
We'll see. Okay, so let's look at 22D, optional clauses addendum, and then at the top of this, as well as every addendum, you're going to put in that information that's on the Form 21, right? That the date of it, the buyer, the seller, and the address of the property, so it all ties in. And then you're going to check. Oh, and by the way, I didn't say that you might or might not use this form. Okay, with financing, you might or might not use it because maybe it's going to be contingent on financing, maybe it's going to be all cash, right? But with this Form 22D, you have no choice because your designated broker here is a Nazi and he's saying you use it in every single transaction, okay? And there's a reason for that. The reason we want to use it in every single transaction is because it has all these option boxes. And even if none of those option boxes are going to be used, we want to have the buyers and sellers' initials at the bottom as evidence or proof that they were given the opportunity to use it. Okay. The last thing we want to have happen is for a buyer of ours to come back after closing and saying, and having their lawyer say, oh, my client never even knew they had the right to have a homeowners association review period. They had no idea. And we want to be able to say, well, it's funny because we had this form out for them and we had them initial both pages of it to show that they were aware of what they were going to not be using. So that's just really a good practice to remember to always use Form 22D, even if they're not going to use any of the option boxes, just have them initial and date the bottom, right? Now the first box, though, You want to make sure it gets checked when you represent that buyer. You want to make sure the buyer checks that box. Well, even if you represent the seller, you want to counteroffer, and you want to make sure that this box is checked, because this box is basically saying that for square footage and for the lot size and dimensions and all that kind of stuff, that the buyer is being put on notice that we are only passing on information we've learned about from the title company and other reliable sources, and that if they really want to know for sure what the square footage is, they need to get a tape measure out, go measure the house. If they want to know what the lot lines are for sure exactly, they need to go get a surveyor and measure them. Most of the time, these property lines are established, and because of laws, if they've been there for 10 years, that's now the property line. Even if it wasn't originally the property line, that's now the property line. If there's a fence there, if there's shrubs there, things like that, right? But it's putting the seller on notice that they need to go out and check those things for themselves, you know, before making the offer, if they have concerns. Or at least before closing. Maybe they want to make the offer, but before closing, they need to go out there and measure it and be sure, because they can't just rely on us. They can't, if this box is checked after closing, they can't come back and sue us. When I say us, I mean you and me. They can't. And that's what we want to do. So if they say, I don't want to have that box checked. Okay, is that because you want to sue me after closing? Seriously, that's the only other option. You want to sue me after closing. I don't think I want to work with you, is what I would want to say. Because I'm not going to take the responsibility for the property lines and the square footage that I read to you from the county's report. If you want to know, you got to go out and measure it. We've got an ongoing lawsuit right now where the buyer on our listing, is our listing, and the buyer represented by an agent from another office closed on it, and then the buyer, even though we had put in the listing that the fence was not the property line, the buyer tried to go out and do stuff to the fence, you know, out to the fence, and was told by the neighbor, no, that's not the property line. This is your property line. And the buyer was like, what? I'm going to sue. And now brought a suit, but unfortunately for him, this was checked, box A. So he can't very well sue his agent, and he can't very well sue us, and he can't very successfully sue the seller, right? Because this was checked. And that's been our great saving grace in this lawsuit, is because we had that checked. So we want to make sure that's checked all the time, whether we're the listing agent or the buyer's agent. Make sense? In paragraph 2, you do not want to check either of those two boxes. Do not check either of those two boxes. The box that says standard owner's coverage is a temptation to check, because you're thinking, yeah, they're just going to get the regular old, you know, standard coverage, right? Standard sounds reasonable. No, it's a complete misnomer, and it really is confusing if you don't understand that what it's talking about there is a policy of title insurance they used to have back in the days of the Wild West and beyond, and then about 30 years ago or so, about 32 years ago, they actually started changing, the title companies started changing their policies to go above and beyond the standard policy. So now it's common to have a policy of title insurance that is better than the standard policy. So if you check that box, you would actually be giving your buyer, lesser title coverage. You don't want to do that, do you? And then the other box in number 2 is for extended coverage, which it's stating in here that the buyer is going to pay for. So this is title coverage is something the seller pays for the buyer. Now it's saying that for extended coverage that the buyer is going to get the extended coverage and pay for it, which could be thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. Because an extended, this particular extended coverage goes beyond the Alta policy, which is what they're getting in our typical transaction. And it's going to require surveys and all kinds of other things. And normally it's not needed. So like 95% of the time, it's not needed. And so I wouldn't suggest checking that box and obligating your buyer to pay for that and get that. I would just leave it unchecked. Then once we get it signed off, before closing, have your buyer get with the title examiner at the title company and have the title examiner give your buyer his or her opinion as to the need for that extended policy. And if they need it, they can get it. But to pre-commit yourself to it seems kind of silly to me. Say yes, me too. Okay, number 3 is for seller cleaning, and so we want to probably check that box every time, right? We want to have even though everybody has a different definition of clean, right? We at least want to have the commitment by the seller that they're going to clean up their house. And if you want something specific, we would have to use an addendum, which we can use this addendum. So on page 2, we have this box down here at the bottom, number 12. Number 12 says other. You could check that box and you could say, in reference to paragraph 3 of this addendum, the seller agrees to professionally shampoo all the carpets. And any other specifics, that your buyer wants to make sure get done. Because otherwise the seller can say, well, it's clean. Yeah, it's not clean, I had it all the time. And really it's just, that's in court, that would probably hold up. Because when the buyer saw it, that gave the buyer a good idea of the cleanliness of that seller, right? Number 4 is for personal property. So you would probably want to check that box also, because what it says in this is that if the seller leaves a bunch of trash and debris, they have to remove it. And if they leave something of value, you have to remove it. And if they leave something of value, like a big screen TV or something, that it becomes the possession of the buyer. So that's probably a good one to check for your buyer. Is number 4. Number 5 is for utilities and representation of utilities. And if you represent the buyer, then you probably, are taking the listing agent's word for it, right? So what they put in the listing, you hope is accurate. There's a couple things you might want to just double check on just to be sure, to be safe. Mainly, the biggest problem that I see come up on this is whether or not it's on sewer or septic. So you want to just make sure. whether it's connected to sewer or whether it's on a septic system. But otherwise, you know, there's not really a reason to distrust the seller. It's reasonable to believe this, the listing agent was putting the right utilities on there, right? Number 6 is for insulation, and so that's for new construction only. So you never use number 6 here with an existing home. You would only use this if it was a brand new home that had not been lived in before. And then you'll find that insulation information either on the listing or else it'll be inside the garage on the wall, usually stapled on fluorescent colored paper by the electrical panel or near the electrical panel. And you put the insulation information in there. Number 7 is for leased equipment. So if you're the buyer's agent, how would you know if you're the buyer's agent if the seller had a leased hot water heater? You would have no way of knowing, would you, if you wasn't the buyer? So a listing agent is the one who's going to be responsible to make sure they've checked with their seller to see if the seller has any leased equipment. Because if the seller has a leased hot water heater or a leased security system or a leased satellite system or at least propane tank out in the yard or whatever it is, the listing agent is going to want to make sure that it's addressed in a counter offer to your offer in this section 7. So the burden isn't really on you as the buyer's agent, the burden's on that listing agent. The listing agent is going to want to make sure that, you know, anything that's leased is being dealt with appropriately. So it gives specifications here in number 7 for a period of time that the buyer has to look at the lease and agree to it or not agree to it and get approved by the whoever's leasing it, you know, to take over that lease. Because usually if there's leased equipment, the seller expects the buyer just to assume and take over that lease, right? Most of the time. Paragraph C, in fact, it's the very last sentence of paragraph C of Form 21 of the purchase and sale contract. It says that if there is anything leased in or on the property, that the seller agrees to acquire clear title to it to give to the buyer. So with that wording pre-printed already in our form, the seller's got to pay it off and buy it free and clear for that new buyer. So if the seller expects the buyer to just take over the lease from them, it's going to have to get addressed here in paragraph 7, right? So make sure on the listing side that you're on top of that. And if you're a buyer's agent, representing the buyer, it doesn't matter that much unless you just want to make sure that that your buyer's offer gets accepted, in which case you want to make sure that you address those things so that the seller and listing agent can say, okay, well, there's an agent I'll be working with who's a good person who's going to take care of us, because we put that in the listing remarks, right? So just that's just one item. So I've been talking about a lot of items today, right? And that's just one item. And how much could that potentially cost a seller to have to pay off the leased equipment because it wasn't addressed here in paragraph 7? It could end up costing the seller anywhere from, you know, $800 to $8,000, depending on what the equipment is they're having to buy. So for the buyer. So I just think we're, you know, we are worth our weight in gold, so to speak, you know, when we know what we're doing.
I got a question. Going back to the seller cleaning. Let's say the seller like refused to get rid of something large that needed to be thrown away. How would he go about that?
I would specifically, well, first of all, I would specifically address that in that paragraph 12 other. And I would put, in the contract that the, so let's say it's an old rusted car in the backyard. So I would say,
Yeah.
The old rusted car in the backyard is to be removed by the seller at seller expense prior to closing. And then we've got it contractually addressed and agreed to. But let's say that it's just, everybody's assuming it's junk and the seller's gonna remove it, right? And the seller doesn't. So, or the seller says they're gonna verbally, but never does, never gets rid of it. Now it's been 3 days after closing and it's still sitting in the backyard and your buyer's upset. Well, what I would suggest to that buyer is that they go ahead and hire a professional to go out and move it and dump it. So they have a receipt to take to small claims court and sue that seller in small claims court.
Perfect. Thank you.
You bet. But you see that can become just an extra hassle for your buyer, right? And so to have the foresight to address it here in paragraph 12 is always the best thing. Mike, didn't I see your name on the recent list of awards for our offices?
I don't think recently. I was on it in October, I think.
Oh, okay. Okay, I just couldn't remember. I thought I saw, I always look at that and I thought I saw your name on it.
I'll
Okay,
have to double check. Maybe it is.
maybe. Okay. Dan's was, I know I saw Dan's on this last one.
Doesn't count when it's your own house.
You know what?
I said it doesn't count when it's your own house.
Oh, it was right. Okay. Okay, so number 8 is to address the homeowners association review period for the buyer. So I would suggest checking that box whenever possible. Now, there are listing agents and sellers who don't want to give the buyer that period of time to get out of the transaction. Which, if you have been in any of my classes, you already know that I think it's always the best policy to give the buyer all the due diligences you can possibly give them, so they can't sue after closing, right? But I kind of understand sometimes why they do this. They will, listing agents will want to counter offer your offer and not give your buyer that homeowners association review period because they don't want to give them that 10-day out, because it does give it's actually a 15-day out, gives your buyer a 15-day out. So what it's saying is that when you check this box, that this A, B, C, D, and E that you see here, that the seller is going to get all that information about the homeowner association to your buyer within 10 days of mutuality. And then from that 10th day that it was due, or sooner if all that material has been delivered, your buyer has 5 days from that time to terminate. So let's say that you're the listing agent. I like being the listing agent. Let's say that I'm the listing agent, you're the buyer's agent, and your offer came in with this box checked, and on the 3rd day of mutuality, I got all those documents to you, all of them, A, B, C, D, and E. Now, from that day I delivered them to you, your buyer has 5 days to terminate based on that information. So what if the seller never got back with that information? What if the listing agent seller never got back to you with that information? Well, so instead you would count from day 10 when it was due. It was due in 10 days. So from day 10, you would count another 5 days your buyer has to terminate. I just think it's really important for the buyer to have that information, to know what their HOA dues are going to be and what type of an organization is this homeowner association. Are they going to be communicative? Are they going to be easy to get a hold of? Are they going to be impossible to get a hold of? You know, whatever it is. I just think it's really important part of the transaction for the buyer to get that. Then we have item 9, which is for the homeowners association transfer fee. And that is that many of the HOAs, mostly with condos, but sometimes in regular HOAs of single family residences, will have move in and move out fees to pay for cleanup of the roads and things like that. And so this paragraph is saying that if the HOA itself has a policy that says who's going to pay for it, then that's who's going to pay for it. But if the HOA doesn't have a policy about who's going to pay for it, then by default it says the seller is going to pay for it. So you don't have to even worry when you represent the buyer. You don't have to worry about checking anything on that one. You can just leave it. But if you're the listing agent, you might want to change that and check buyer on there, right? And say if there's a HOA here, buyer's got to pay for their move-in fees or whatever it is they charge. Number 10 is for excluded items, meaning that the seller has something attached to the house that they're going to take off and take with them. Maybe it's a chandelier, maybe it's a some shelving in the garage, whatever it is. This is the seller's really only opportunity to identify items that have become affixed and a part of the real property that they're going to take with them when they leave. Otherwise, seller's got to leave it because it's become attached, affixed to the property. No questions about that? Okay. Number 11. I would recommend you checking that box every time. Whether you represent the buyer or the seller, doesn't matter. It should be there. The home warranties are so cheap for what they get for them, you know. So you pay whatever between $250 and $400 probably. And if something goes wrong during that first year with the property, then the home warranty company will go out and fix it for like a $60 deductible or something like that. It's awesome. When I bought a rental house in Arizona and the agent I used to buy it just wouldn't let me deny that. I kept saying, no, I don't want it. She kept saying, no, you do want it. You want to get it. You want to get it. You want to pay for it. You want to have it on. And she just kept pushing. So I said, okay, I'll get it. And sure enough, within the first 2 months, the air conditioner blew out and I had to get a whole new air conditioner. Had to get another one the next year. They just kept replacing them, putting in new air conditioners. It was awesome. You know, those would have been, you know, hugely expensive things. And they just put them in. I paid $60 each time for deductible. There was a leak in that house and in the upstairs, and it caused damage to the floor and ceiling from downstairs, and it caused water damage. And they went in and fixed the whole thing, and I just paid $60 because I got them. So I just strongly recommend that you check it, and whoever pays for it, doesn't even matter who pays for it. You know, it's part of negotiation. Maybe you're gonna pay half of it, maybe the other agent in the transaction is gonna pay the other half of it, maybe the seller's gonna pay a third of it, and each of the agents is gonna pay a third, it doesn't matter, but I just think it's super important to have that in place on that property for your new buyer's purchase. Because if something can go wrong, it's almost always gonna be that first year.
Can they still get a home warranty if that box is not checked?
Yes. Yes. I'm not sure exactly how they would do it. The title company would know and they would figure it out for you. Yeah, but I like to see it checked just so that we have that record contractually that we were doing our job and recommending they get it and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
In fact, the errors and emissions company that we use if we get sued, we go through an errors and emissions insurance company and they have me fill out a sheet about the transaction that this lawsuit is over. And if we have a deductible, it's going to be $5,000, for the deductible. But if we had a home warranty checked or waived in writing by the buyer, they waive the deductible. The E&O company will waive the deductible. Isn't that awesome? So some have suggested that I make it a policy, that we have to have it in every transaction, which I haven't done yet, but I'm tempted to. Because that in the long run would just save everybody. But I would just really recommend you get that for your buyer. And then that number 12 is for other, so that if there was a situation where you had to write something in there, just usually it's for disclosure purposes. You have a space there where you can check the other box and write that disclosure in there. Like I just gave you a recommendation of one that would be that the seller is not making this sale contingent on getting financing, but is in fact borrowing money from a non-conforming lender, and seller agrees to participate in allowing the lender entry for inspection purposes. Is something you might put in there. Purchaser, oh, I know, here's one for Dan. Seller is a licensed real estate broker. Maybe that's what you put in there. That's all you put in there. Seller is a licensed real estate broker. Yeah, that's a disclosure. And so that's a good place to put that kind of thing in there. If you're having difficulty with the words and how you want to use them, and you just want to feel sure about it, then just go ahead and text me or email me the wording you're thinking about using, and I'll give you any suggestions, or just say that looks great, whatever it is. Heidi, you've done that before, haven't you? No?
Done what? Done what?
Have you ever asked me to look over some wording that you're putting in a Form 34? Or
Oh yeah, regularly.
regularly? Thought you did.
I usually call and I'm run it by you.
Okay. Good enough. And that's what I'm for. As a designated broker, I want you to feel free to do that. So text me, email me during the day, call me, and I'll be happy to help you with whatever you're working on. Okay, so if you have a short sale, which is really unusual these days, but sometimes we have short sales, you use Form 22SS for any short sales that you would be doing. You should be using Form 22T in every transaction, or at least attempting to use Form 22T. That's the title contingency. It gives your buyer a chance to see if there's any reserved oil and mineral rights on that property, or if there's any easements that are going to affect their use of it, or if there's any deed restrictions that would affect their use of the property. which are not covered in the other forms. So this is the only place, 22T, that they can get that protection to check that out before they get to the closing table. Because if they get to the closing table, it's too late. They would just have to close or forfeit their earnest money if there was reserved oil and mineral rights. Okay. Thank you all for being here today. And then next week, I'll be going over the inspections contingency process in Form 35 and 35W. And so I hope to see you again next week.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
You bet.
Yeah,
John.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.